As the only company in India that's on the GEI, can you talk a bit about what was your company's reason for bringing this transparency? Why is transparency important to you?
So transparency is important for us largely because we're today operating in about 35 countries. Each country has got its own rules and regulations. At the same time, we're trying to ensure that we're in line with the changing regulations as well. So when we are transparent and we open up our policies to scrutiny, then we know where we stand, both within the country and internationally as well. And that's something that we value the feedback, and we continuously keep doing it. This is also something that is understood and appreciated both in terms of our internal as well as the external stakeholders as well.
So Dr. Reddy says 23,000 employees globally, 18,000 in India. With this transparency, we're seeing some positive data, and we're seeing some not so positive data. I'm going to start with the not so positive. So 1 out of your 13 people in top management is a woman. What are you doing about trying to change that?
So we operate in close to about 30 countries. So in terms of our operations in most of the emerging markets as well as in the developed part, a large number of our leaders are women, and in many of the countries they dominate the field force as well as the senior leadership positions. For example, if you take a country like Russia, all the sales and marketing heads, head of legal, head of HR are all women leaders. We have several country heads who are women leaders, and in the US as well, several of the function heads are the women leaders. But when it comes to India, there is a lot of pressure on the women to play a dual role and to take care, to be a caregiver as well as to take care of the home. And that puts some amount of pressure in terms of the way in which we see post-pregnancy there is a dropout in terms of the talent that is available for us to recruit. So what we started to do are several initiatives. First and foremost, we have identified a set of about 25 leaders in the middle management, currently going through a 9-month leadership development program where they're being exposed to both internal and external faculty on how could they be ready to handle bigger teams. At the same time, we have been able to also look at several initiatives both within the sales as well as in manufacturing. In manufacturing, we have created and became compliant to have the workforce, women workforce, work both in the morning shift as well in the night shift as well. And internally, we have taken a target that in the current year, we would like to have at least 2 of our facilities being headed by women leaders. So a lot of activities that we continuously keep doing in India, largely to encourage and to develop more women leaders, but we have several of them internationally.
Okay. Now, on your board, between 2017 and 2018, you doubled your female representation from 1 to 2. How difficult was it to find that board member? And how has it affected the discourse within the boardroom?
So I think in India there are a lot of very able and very capable business leaders. So it was not difficult at all for us to invite and have 2 very strong board members on Dr. Reddy's independent directors. Of course, we have looked at their competence and capability when we have taken them on the board, not to balance the diversity. But of course, not only the women board members, the other board members too keep encouraging and pushing us to consider having more leaders in India at the senior leadership level and keep having these conversations on a quarterly basis when we have the board meetings.
And your overall representation, we're just going to stick with the data here for a minute. Your overall representation across your workforce is about 18%, quite low. Can you talk a little bit about why that is specifically in the manufacturing sector and how the numbers look differently depending on where you are in the world?
So if you take just from a point of sales, in many of the countries outside of India, a large workforce are actually women. If you take Russia, 70% of our sales representatives are women, so is also in Ukraine and China and several other Latin American countries. But when it comes to India, it has been a challenge. So what we have done are two things. So what so for women who have taken a break after their maternity leave, we have been able to come back and to create a separate role called a hospital service executive, where they are able to go and meet the doctors and consult with them and give the education that is required. And this is something called SHE, that has actually worked very well, and we have been able to double this number. Last year also we have been able to create a specific field force in the dermocosmetic segment, which is both led by women leaders as well as the representatives are women representatives. So we are making initiatives at the entry level, at the mid-management level to increase this number. What probably would come relatively easier in other markets because of the availability of the talent pool, and more importantly, the fact that Dr. Reddy's considers in an unbiased manner only the meritocracy in terms of the way in which people progress within the organization and the way in which we are equipping the members of Dr. Reddy's to pick up new skills to continue to grow within the organization. That's something that we have to lay significantly more efforts in India, and we are doing that to increase the diversity within India.
So if we just move beyond the issue of gender, can you talk a little bit about your initiatives around hiring and assimilating people with disabilities?
So this is again something that we deeply believe in. So we have been hiring people with disabilities both in India and in international markets. What we have been able to do very recently is to reach out to the people we have already hired and ask them what kind of a company they think they have joined, what kind of facilities we are able to provide to them, and how are the co-workers treating them. And whatever feedback that has come, we have spread that feedback to the 22,000 employees in our quarterly communication conversation, so that everyone is aware of what and how one should work and behave with a person with physical disabilities. So what we have been consciously doing is to ensure that all our workplaces are conducive for the people with disabilities to easily move around. And we have been making some other conscious efforts. For example, when we had recently a hire who was hearing impaired within the department, we taught the basic sign language for the people so that the people within the department are able to interact with the person who has joined us. So this is a continuous effort. We are doing it in other countries. For example, in a country like Russia, it is mandatory that 2% of the workforce have to be people with disabilities. That's something that we have been able to do. We have also received the recognition from the government as one of the first companies to have done this. So even in India, we reach out to NGOs and we reach out to government agencies to seek people with disabilities to join Dr. Reddy's.
So when we were speaking before this discussion and realized that we have two interesting things in common. We both worked and lived in Russia, and we both have been at our companies for 26 years. So I wanted just to ask a little bit about your evolution at Dr. Reddy's. You started, I think, in the very low ranks, and you've now seen a lot of evolution, and especially in the area of diversity and inclusion. And you yourself, I think we would describe you as a male ally. So why don't you talk a little bit about the evolution for yourself and for the company that you've seen?
So after I finished my MBA, it was around the time 91, 92 when we're talking about globalization. I wanted to actually build a made in India brand internationally. So one of the companies that was talking about globalization was Dr. Reddy. So I joined them as a management trainee and had the opportunity to build business for Dr. Reddy's in about 25 countries across all the continents. What I think has remained constant with Dr. Reddy's has been the reason why Dr. Reddy's has existed as an organization which is largely to ensure access of affordable medicines. And that's stayed constant from the day that we got together as an organization. And this is something that we live on a daily basis. So the two core elements of Dr. Reddy's is empathy and dynamism. So we're able to perceive what is the needs of the patients, and what you could see is whether it is a developed market or a developing market, whether you look at medicines that are paid by the patient out of pocket or it is paid by the government, there is a huge need to have affordable and high quality medication. And whenever we have been able to take that into the market, we have been able to see that the patients have hugely benefited. And I can give you an example of how we have been living this on a daily basis. For example, Laura spoke about Russia. We are about number 13 by value in the prescription business in Russia, but number 1 by volume. So even though our products are very well accepted in that market and considered as Narodny Preparat, which in Russian translation means people's products, we have not taken advantage of our brands and increased the prices, but we've ensured accessibility. Even within India, when biosimilars, which are the large molecules, were not available, we were the first company to have developed a biosimilar, largely used today in oncology. The usage of the product after the first biosimilar was introduced went up by 10 times. So there is a huge undermet and unmet needs today, both in emerging markets and in the developed markets, and that's something that we continue to do on a daily basis.
Now, Bloomberg has written quite a lot about some of the controversy around generic drugs. Dr. Reddy has, as you said, committed to improved access to medicine, and the generics are priced extremely low, and at the same time, there's challenges in some of the developed markets in terms of the rigorous standards that you need to meet, and there's been quite a lot of pushback in the US and in Europe. So are we at a point now where the prices are going to have to rise in order for companies like yourselves to meet these standards?
So globally, because of the fact that we operate in about 35 countries, it's not just the regulators from the developed markets, but even the developing market regulators, whether it is from Brazil, whether it is from China, from Southeast Asia, they all regularly come and audit us. And the standards are increasing by the day. And that's today a ticket to play. So what Dr. Reddy's basically does, it works on how do we improve the productivity within the organization, whether it is on the R&D productivity or the sales productivity, and continuously look at how do we eliminate the waste. And a combination of both the elimination of the waste and the productivity improvement has ensured that while we have the plants which are completely compliant, it is still, we're able to grow very healthy in terms of the profits. The last year growth in profits was about 50%. First quarter of this year, we grew the profits by about 30%. So I think today in terms of the ticket to play, ensuring that you are completely compliant with all the regulatory requirements of the countries is a must, and there is no compromise in that.
Can you talk a little bit about so you're trying to be more efficient, willing to take lower profits in order to keep the drug costs low and meet the higher standards?
So we have been working on sustainability for a long time. So if you talk about the sustainability on energy, about 23% of the energy today that we use is the renewable energy. We're today about 50% water neutral, and at the same time in the last year alone we did about 188 projects on energy conservation, which saved close to 96,000 tons of carbon dioxide getting into the air, and at the same time it's equivalent to almost 48 lakh trees being planted in a single year. So what we have been able to do on a continuous basis is look for waste, eliminate the waste, look for conservation. But at the same time, a large part of the work has been the way in which we have been able to develop our team in improving both the R&D productivity as well as the sales productivity as well. And that's something has led to ensuring that we have the resources that is required to continuously ensure that our facilities are compliant with all of the regulations around the world.
So in the GEI, one of the things that we look at is whether you have a supplier diversity program, and at the moment you do not.
No.
And I wanted to ask why and whether you're considering starting that.
We are considering that. Right now, we don't have a supplier diversity program, but what we do is we do annual audits, and we actually check the diversity within the vendors that we have, but we have not yet set up the conversations with them on how to improve and how would we have the sourcing from them, and that's something that we are considering.
Okay. And finally, there's an interesting statistic that you've disclosed, which is while the percentage of women in the workforce is about 18%, when you look at the top 10% of compensated, it's 22% women, which is unusual. Usually it's lower. So can you explain why that is?
That's because many of the top leaders that we have internationally are all women leaders, and obviously because we benchmark our salaries to the local country standards, that's the reason why the top 22% of the global pay is for women within the company.
And have you looked at the compensation discrepancies within India itself?
We have done that. For every country, we go with the local country standards, and we ensure that there's no bias in the way in which we make the pay.
So just to discuss, since you're the only India company on the GEI, is that surprising to you? Do you foresee other companies going forward and disclosing their data like you have?
Sure. I think today a lot of work is happening across many of the Indian corporates. Of course, we do expect that more would come within the gambit of the GEI. We feel very proud, and this is something that we communicate internally, and we have conversations with the people, even though we don't have a particular standard, but we basically have conversations with each of their leaders on what would they take as a target to improve the diversity within their business within that particular year, and on a half-yearly basis, we're then seeing whether or not we've achieved that target. So that's something that we will continue to do. We feel very proud of the fact that we are one of the companies that have been recognized, and we will strive, obviously, to continue to be within the index.
And do you find that the data that is difficult to actually track? I mean, because of joining the GEI, have you had to start tracking data that you weren't tracking before?
So what we need to do in order to make this happen, obviously it is a group of the management council and the L-1 who basically run various businesses and functions. So the conversations are largely to the group of about these 35, 40 leaders in terms of what we would take within the year, how would we make it happen, and then the conversation within the HR community as well to make this happen. So to have the conversations and to move and to recognize people who are making efforts to improve the diversity, this is not an issue at all, and this is continuously recognized within the organization.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.